It's my pleasure to kick off our fall series of events. We have a number of really interesting events planned. There's a whole bunch of posters outside that you can look at on your way out as well. I'm really pleased that my colleague Neringa Klumbytė has agreed to talk about her experiences this summer. Neringa spent a month in Ukraine this summer working on her ongoing research project, which collects oral histories and stories of Ukrainians who have lived under or are living under Russian occupation. Of course, everyone knows about the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched in February of 2022. I hope most of you know that that was part of a larger war launched by Russia on Ukraine that began in 2014 with the seizure of the Crimean Peninsula. And that is part of a longer history of contested relations between Russia and its neighbor Ukraine. You might also, of course, know that about 20% of Ukrainian territory right now is occupied by Russian troops. We get stories about the front lines, we get stories about the meanings of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, but we often don't get stories, because it's hard to get stories, of that 20% of the population that is living under occupation, and what that means. And that's what makes Dr. Klumbytė's ongoing research so valuable. So, I don't want to take up any more time because we want to hear these stories, and I know that people who shared them with Dr. Klumbytė want you to hear them too. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Neringa Klumbytė.
Thank you all for coming to this afternoon lecture about Ukraine. Of course, I have a lot of thanks, and this is not an exhaustive list, to a lot of people, including the director of the Haviger Center, Dr. Stephen Norris, who very much supported the idea of collecting an archive, and our Miami University, the Haviger Center, will be the home for this archive of those stories of occupation. So I will move on to tell you a little bit about the project itself. So I myself was born in Lithuania, so I lived under occupation. And when Vadim Leshenko from Ukraine suggested that we research and collect those stories, I really was fascinated by this idea. So it is kind of a grassroots idea. Idea that is coming from Ukrainian people, and now we have already a huge archive. I talked to about 100 people, like official interviews, there are less. It's in Ukraine, Lithuania, United States, and online. And among these people, the time that they spent under occupation is from 16 days to over 3 years, and you can see the different regions where they lived under occupation. So for those who do not know much about Ukraine, there are a few maps. So I just mapped one on the United States. So that's the Ukraine map on the United States, and the other is on Europe. This is the biggest country in Europe, and that's how the area looks like. That's the portion that is occupied that Dr. Norris just mentioned. If we map it on Europe or United States, we could see that the entire Ohio would be occupied. Here is for us to see the dynamics, and in the beginning, we have a lot of Ukraine occupied, and here you see by the date how it is changing. So you saw that parts of the Kyiv Oblast and Chernihiv Oblast, right, were occupied in the very beginning, and some of those interviews and some of the stories come from Kyiv Oblast, and these were the areas that were not occupied for a long time. So people lived like a couple weeks, and of course the story in eastern Ukraine is different. In eastern Ukraine is different because even now some places are under occupation, as you could see. Much of it was liberated during the Kharkiv offensive, and Donetsk, Luhansk regions, as well as Crimea, were occupied since 2014. We have some stories from these areas as well. So that's an ongoing process of the occupation, and I realized, when we started studying it, that this is something that not even covered extensively in literature. You just see countries come, they occupy, something happens, but the process itself, the occupation as such, what is it, is not really addressed. We know about colonialism, we know about post-colonial liberation. We know those liberation stories, but the occupation itself, it seemed to me, is not is something that we should kind of look into more depth and conceptualize, especially addressing what people are living through when they end up under occupation. And in this case, in the case of Ukraine. So today is 1,299th day of full-scale invasion. The war started, as I mentioned, in 2014, and you could see, how that's how many million are currently in Ukraine, 37.8 as of 2024. We have at least 14,000 civilian casualties, 10 million displaced. Among them, 3.7 million are internally displaced. And these are many people from occupied territories. They had to flee to escape occupation, and I will tell you the story, what it means to escape occupation. This is not that simple. And this is how much Russian army personnel died in this war. Now, here are just a list of, those major processes, events, social, economic, political, very much based from people's interviews, what happens when you are occupied, right? What happened to them when they were occupied during the full-scale invasion. So, like very broadly, we can say that's depriving people of human rights and freedoms. So it's inflicting terror and violence, abruption of social structures. So you could read through this extensive list. I will comment on it during the talk. And here, they would write "люди," which is in Russian people, well, and in Ukrainian as well, in order to, that's in Bucha, on that main street where hundreds of people were killed, so they would not, shoot or attack. And in Bucha, when you go on that street, the main street where a lot of people were killed, all the gates and fences are just warped now after many years, well, not many, but several years. They warped with bullets, and you could see all kind of damage still there. So let's start. Our first question, when we do those interviews is how the war started for you, because occupation started with the war, and I primarily will focus on the full-scale invasion. And this is what one informant, there is another very interesting thing, because what people did when they were occupied, they deleted all their social media, most of them, deleted all the pictures, everything. And for this kind of picture, you could get in big trouble. So this is a very rare, in a sense, rare images that we could see. This is in Gostomel, that's the Kyiv region, where lots of helicopters came in order to start the invasion and offense of Kyiv. So that's one of actually your age man took a short video of of that first day. And when I talked to people and asked them, most of them have a very strong emotional recollections of the first day. And just imagine if the war started here, right, in Ohio, we would remember probably all the details, what we ate, where we looked, where we called, what we said, and they could talk forever about that first day. And what, is kind of very much taking the emotion is that we couldn't believe it. We could not believe that the war started. We thought, this is something that belongs to movies, games, video games, but not to reality. So that suspense, you know, of this is not really true, kept them at home, many of them, because they thought cannot be true, you know. Nobody believed that the war has started. So they stayed home and they thought this just somehow miraculously disappear, right? This is that bad dream. And, you know, I was thinking, you know, how to communicate to you what that feeling of occupation is all about. And one night I had a dream that, well, this was, I don't know, probably because I was in Ukraine, you know, that I was in trenches and that Russian soldiers, you know, the Russian army soldiers were coming very close. And I thought, if I don't move, you know, nothing will happen to me. And then I realized they will step on me and they will notice me anyway. So, and that's when I woke up because I was so anxious. I thought I'm going to get killed in the dream. So have you ever had a dream where you are so anxious that you wake up because you cannot dream it anymore? Have you? Think whatever it was, you know, maybe not about trenches. I hope so. You didn't dream that kind of dream. So that's how it feels in occupation, I realized. That's something that would help you to understand. It's just that you never wake up, right? You live in that kind of fear and that kind of anxiety, and it doesn't go away. So that's how it started for many of these people. And now I will take you just to a few little towns. Well, not that little, like this one is 13,000 before the war, and the other was about 40,000. I would need to check those numbers, but anyway, so Borodyanka in Kyiv region, not too far from Kyiv. So here, you know, they used all kind of forbidden illegal weapons, like cluster bombs, flechettes, unguided missiles. So that's what was used, those flechettes. You see my own hand in the museum in Borodyanka, where they collected all that stuff. So that's flechettes, you know, they can fly and disperse, and there are lots of them, and they can, you know, kill. And people who were killed in Bucha were found with those flechettes in their bodies. So this place was basically the main street, and you could see, you know, how it was bombed. It was basically leveled up, you know, that's what you see. Borodyanka May 1st, occupied on the first day of war, but that's, you know, when it was indiscriminately bombed. And people died under rubble, and those whom I talked to said they heard voices for help, and the Russian army soldiers did not allow to help them. So this is another tragic story that's near Bucha. Now, one of the planes, after bombing those high-rises, came back and shot at you know, a well-known Ukrainian figure, Taras Shevchenko, who was a poet who fought against Russian imperialism with his poetry, and you could see a hole in his head. So it came back, you know, shot at this monument, and then flew away, and that's when Ukrainians shot him. So they call it, you know, Shevchenko revenge, because that plane was down, and, you know, they have all kind of images, not images, but all kind of artifacts from that plane in their little museum. So this is Borodyanka in July 2025. That's the main street that you saw on the map. One of the homes that is, you know, already standing, being rebuilt. I talked to a person on the street. He was just sitting on a bench, a very sad man in his 70s, and he said, you know, well, part of that house, it's not this house, but his house was already restored, but my part, he said, is not restored yet, so I live with the neighbor on the side that is already renovated, but my home will be fixed much later. So whenever you stop by, there are always tragic stories, right? And although our goal was to collect everyday stories of occupation, the tragedies and crimes were always there. And so, for example, he himself, was alone, and he said, what can I do now? I cannot work, I'm already old, what is my life going to be like? And he lost his wife, and this is not like, she was not shot, their home was not shelled. She died because she was very sick already, and they didn't have medication. He couldn't take her to the hospital, and he buried her in the garden. And he was still mourning, when I was talking to him. It's just, a person on the street, another person that I talked to, she spent at that time of, when bombing took place, she was in another basement, luckily not also on that main street, but on the opposite side. So luckily her house was not destroyed, but she said the impact and explosions were so strong that I suffered from concussion, being in the basement and hiding there. All right, so now another town like Kupiansk, which is on the eastern part, that place was I kind of didn't warn you, that I will be telling about these stories, but I think if I'm talking about the war, so if anybody feels like you cannot listen more about that, so just feel free to leave. So Kupiansk, until September, from February, was not really much destroyed, only some places. It's not the story of it's not the story of this place, right? It's not the story of Borodyanka, but it was liberated by the Ukrainian army in September 2022. However, this city is near the front line, right? So you could see where that black circle is. That's how it looks, that's the deep state map from the close up. And, the situation there is just very sad. And now it is leveled, but it was leveled later, right? It was not leveled during occupation. So for people, most people, of course, left. Some got killed in shelling after occupation. And those who left, they were reporting one by one, saying, okay, now I lost my school because the school was destroyed. Then I lost, the entire memories that are collected to this place because that part of Kupiansk was destroyed. And then, their own homes get destroyed as well. So this is kind of a different story of occupation. They remember how they lived under occupation, and we'll talk about that. But at that point, the town was not destroyed itself. So wherever we go, I give you just the two examples, there will be different stories, right? There were not buchas everywhere, but there were, places like Borodyanka, which is close to Bucha, and there were, places which were, kind of relatively, right? Relatively not destroyed and not major killing sites. So this is what one informant said, one person that we interviewed, that only death is worse than occupation. And I will try now to explain to you why. So first, home. Home is of very high importance to all these people. And I don't know how we could connect to that, but just imagine most of them, who live in those towns, they inherited those homes from their parents. They spend, this is, how they had a picture, they're just very peaceful, right? You can see how that garden is tended and every grass, right, is taken care of. And this is something for them that served as protection, Some didn't want to leave those homes because they knew that, then they will be robbed, that, army soldiers will move in and, stay there. So this was something that they felt, if we stay, we will preserve our homes. Plus, there was that kind of understanding, that it's secure here, and this is kind of counterintuitive, right? We would think leaving to a safe place is secure. But many people did not have enough income to go. They did not have, they did not know anybody where to go. And this required, resources, this required knowledge, this required money also to move out of the occupied area. So that's the same home, that I just showed to you, and the missile landed rocket just right in front of the entrance. So what they did, so this is near Kherson, in a smaller town. And I don't know if you have heard, but the Russian army blew Kakhovka Dam, which covered, a large area flooded, many people died and many animals died as well. And this area was flooded. So first, their home gets bombed. They fix it, they stay there, and then it gets flooded, And after flood, they had to move out because there was nothing basically left. So they got a boat, and just went to see their own home, which was flooded. So they speak in Russian here. The eastern Ukraine, there are lots of people who are Russian speakers. So you could hear the Russian language. Okay, now escape, right? So I mentioned, that many could not believe that this is going to last, and many expected also after they learned that Kyiv region was liberated. In eastern Ukraine, they also hope that they will be liberated pretty soon. And some areas got liberated, but not that soon as the Kyiv or Chernihiv territories. Now, I don't know if you could guess what that is. You could see that these are cars, right? So this is a monument now. But people tried to leave, and there are lots of memories, how they just got shot on their way out. So you couldn't just simply leave from the occupied area. There were checkpoints, there were soldiers everywhere, and there were multiple testimonies where people were killed when they were trying to leave. So simply leaving was not an option. Only when there were those green corridors, only then they were able to leave. So these are the cars of those people who got killed, and it's now like a memorial. Now, the other kind of key phrase, understanding what the experience was like, they would say it's like a prison. And those people who did leave the area, whether than Melitopol or Mariupol, they remember it as also very much emotionally, in a very similar way like the first day of war. Why prison, right? So fear, right? Fear is also something that is very dominant, but also because of all kind of terror that was part of that occupation. So with the Russians come Підвали. Підвали means basement, but I would like to let you know that it's not the basement that probably you have at home, right? Where you can play games, table tennis, right? Or what else you play, or watch TV, or do something else with your friends where there is carpet. Those basements are very different, They are usually not even, they don't have even floor in some cases. And this is the basement that is recreated in World War II Museum in Kyiv, how it looked like. So what it means, that with Russians come Підвали. So first of all, that term, like now basement, you all have associations of what basement is, right? And just imagine, if occupation happens, that is completely resignified, right? It becomes like a different word. So that's what happened for people in Ukraine, So first of all, it was shelters, right? So you hide, you go into the basement because that's where you can escape from shelling. But also these were torture chambers. So Russians, or not necessarily Russians, when I say Russians, I mean, Russian army soldiers, could be Chechens, could be Buryats. They would mention, what else? I'm trying to think, that there might have been other nationalities that were in the Russian army. Of course, there were people recruited and mobilized from Luhansk areas and Donetsk as well. But people would most often would mention these nationalities. So they would take people and they would disappear sometimes, or they would, keep them in those also called Підвали, which is basements, right, which were torture chambers. There were also yamy pits, and we have testimonies where they would just drop people and keep that. One person that we talked to was kept there for 17 days with just little food in just a hole in the earth. So this reminded me, since I studied Holocaust earlier, it reminded me Malinas, which in Vilnius would be places where Jewish people would hide from Nazis. And in that sense, when we think of occupation in broader terms, so Lithuania was occupied, Vilnius was occupied by Nazis, this is something, those basements, right, as something you go down, right, you go to hide, you go to survive and you go under the earth, right? This is something for us to keep in mind. Now, this is one of the basements that I visited, so that's in the student dorm in one little town. And this is how it looked like inside. So that's where people spend a lot of time hiding from shelling and just trying to survive. That's how it looks like. And it was February, right, in March. It was cold. So the lady that shows us around, she tells, that's where the beds were, that's where we would eat and sleep. And that was for many people. Okay, now ambient terror, right? I mentioned fear. So that fear is for all kind of things. One of those major elements, I think of that fear is being afraid to be seen as a woman, right? Some people from Kherson said that women would shave their heads, and you probably can understand why, right? They were afraid to be seen as young people who could be potentially mobilized, right? Like one woman who was older, she said, she would just mess up her hair, dress in a very, drag kind of clothing, stand behind the corner and see when nobody is around, then she would walk, because you need to get out to get food. Lots of people just stayed home because they were afraid to be seen, right? They were afraid to encounter those who could see them. And that was a part of fear and part of the experience. Now, they were afraid also to interact to people because you never know, right, who could be a collaborator. They were afraid to be detained or mobilized, as I said, to be killed. They were worried for their own family. And that kind of captures a lot already, right? Why occupation is worse than a war. So when now they live during the war, they still remember occupation that's the worst page of it because of all that fear and, what came with it. And there are all kind of, insecurities there. You could be robbed. So some people just stayed home because they knew that they could just come in, and take whatever they want to, right? You cannot say no or anything to people with, Kalashnikovs, right? And one lady was living not too far from the border with Crimea, which Crimea is not controlled by Ukraine now. So she said on the first day of war, there were many tanks and all kind of, military equipment that was coming to Ukraine. And then a few days after, there were lots of, cars, train cars going back to Crimea and Russia through Crimea with washing machines, right? With all kind of, electronics, all kind of stuff, that was robbed from people's homes, but also from the stores where they could get them. So those stories, are just incredible. Like they would film, for example, in that basement that I showed you. They would come to that basement to see people, and they would bring all kind of things like toys for children from the local store that they just robbed. And they would film and ask people to say thank you, well, they asked before filming, of course, and that would be a propaganda movie for Russia, how nice they are, right? And how local people knew, that this is from their local store that they are giving these things. So that's the generosity, right, of occupying forces. Human safari, does anybody know what that is? Well, you don't count, Marcello. He was in Ukraine himself. So this is just, random shooting, which was also reported on first days, that they just go out to shoot people. In some areas, this was also reported. Now, when I talk to those people who like games, so faculty doesn't, most of the faculty here probably don't count, right? But students probably will know what I mean. That's what they, one person especially would invoke, So those dystopian games, does anybody know this game?
Line. Welcome to City 17. You have shelter or been chosen to relocate to one of our finest Canadian urban centers.
Nobody knows this game? That's Half-Life 2? You do. Okay. So the game was created in 2004.
Overwatch stopped our
Cannot stop it now. So the game Half-Life 2 was created in 2004. So for you, it's kind of a long time ago, but I know that some still know it, but not many apparently. You moved on to other games. But this is a dystopian story where your country is occupied by aliens, and this is the collaborative government, and you live like in prison, right, under constant surveillance. So that's the point. That's the reference that they give when younger, right, generation students, when I ask them what occupation was like for you, what associations do you have with occupation? That's what they would refer me to. Okay. So what happens, right, in occupation, right? More of that, a lot of loss, right? You cannot provide for the family, you cannot work. There is restriction of mobility that I mentioned, deterioration of health, right? For example, you need insulin, you cannot get it, right, because the borders are closed. Then, stories go, it depends on the area, that there was some provision from Russia, but that did not work, and sometimes I think how much it's psychological, how much it's real, why Russian insulin, maybe it was of lower quality, it did not work. But that kind of, that body's refusal of occupation is at all the levels. The food did not taste well, You could not eat in general during occupation. You could not take Russian medication, right? You could not take their humanitarian aid. So there is that, like embodied refusal, embodied rejection of everything that comes as well. So there was, just deprivation of knowledge. And I think this is something that would be very hard for your generation who are used to live with phones, right? Day and night. Well, not all the night, but like my son takes it in the evening with him as well to fall asleep. So there was no internet for a lot of time. And then when internet was reestablished, it was Russian propaganda. So ultimately, you end up living without really resources and knowledge of what is happening in the world. Of course, people developed all kinds of safety strategies. They limited communication, their mobility, they avoided occupational forces, they saved food, and to some extent, at some point, there is also that normalization of terror and misrecognition of violence as well. I thought, I cannot disclose their identities. I thought about telling, their stories, but I see, that I have to leave time for, so these are not real faces, for the question. So let me just tell about few people from this, and I picked, some who are close to your age. So let's say Daria from Chernihiv Oblast. She left Chernihiv to stay with her parents near Chernihiv because she thought this will be safer. Chernihiv ended up being not occupied. Her parents' village ended up being occupied, and she lived the entire month in occupation. So she ended up in, she lived in that basement. Actually, it was kind of the basement. It's just another term in the garden where people would keep their vegetables and potatoes for winter. They lived there for 5 days. Then, one person offered them to help them move to the factory basement because that was safer. He said, I will take only women and children. So she had to leave her father, and she did not know whether he's going to survive. The father, who was over 70 years old, walked kilometers, to that factory basement himself, and he actually survived. They also left, dogs and cats. That's another story. Her dog and cat also survived, but hearing her tell the story how you are leaving, kind of your family member, right, to die, is very difficult to bear. They didn't have what to eat. She heard them discussing these were soldiers in her case from somewhere from Siberia. And they heard them discussing how they are going to sexually abuse her. She testified, that 3 people died during that month in that basement of natural causes. So these are kind of indirect victims of occupation. They were not shot, but they just died out of stress or heart failure or whatever. She doesn't even know. They buried them in that basement. Now the story is, her story is that her husband was in Paris. He was in French Legion, and he was trained by the French. And when the war started, he came back. She was supposed to go to Paris. If not the war, she would end up in Paris with him. He came back to defend Ukraine. And, when she finally escaped from occupation, they met in Kyiv, and although she was not able to get pregnant many years, she got pregnant. She gave birth to her son. well, and her husband died near Kupiansk, defending his own friends. So she lives in terrible loss, and she remembers occupation, nevertheless, as the worst part of all of this, you know. But this, you know, what we could see from this story, you know, that it kind of interconnects and interrelates with the war, you know, as well. And it's not the end, right? Until the war is over, there will be no full healing for these people, even if they escaped occupation. Now, let's say Serhi from Kyiv Oblast, he also escaped Kyiv because he thought that he will be safer. He ended up in a gray zone, you know, in between Ukrainian and Russian army. So he was the one who couldn't eat at all, lost 15 kilos in 10 days, finally was able from that gray zone escape. He said, I'm not going to tell all the details, but you know, the outcomes of all of this and how it affected himself. He started, I started drinking. My mom lost hearing. So you could see, you know, how all those experiences could be terrible for people. He is IT specialist. He has an excellent job. He works for a foreign company. And I said, why don't you leave? He said, you know, I don't want to add another insecurity to my life. Here I have a good job, and at least I know, you know, that I have income. I'm economically stable. All right, so I would like you to look at this quote because it also captures the experiences of occupation, and I will finish in a few minutes very well. Day after day, and this is from Luhansk, a person who lived in Luhansk in 2014. You gradually lose your human form, self-respect, pride, dignity. They are slowly drained from you by fear. The most educated person turns into a wild animal. For me, there is no heroism in survival. It's just a question of how quickly you stop being human. The faster, the better your chances of seeing tomorrow. Now, yeah, I had this for you. Okay, so let's watch it just very quickly.
You wake up in the morning and feel it's written. On February 24, 2022, I was literally crushed by the news. I think war had begun.
This person did not leave home for 9 months in Kherson. He was afraid to leave. Only his wife would go out, and he stayed and just saw everything through his balcony, and he created, he's an artist.
The whole world shrank for me to the size of the wing.
The world shrank for me to the size of the wing. And that's his story in the diary that he created, but that was all he could see in all that time. Now, what helped to survive? Religion, family, friends, love, right? Music, resistance, hope, and, you know, some created music. And this is also something that, you know, what was very astonishing to me to see that no matter, you know, that quote that I cited you, when you talk to people, you see that they preserve their humanity. I would think like, you know, did you share food, I would ask, and they would say, of course, you know, if we had. And I said, how about, you know, you didn't know if you are going to have tomorrow. Well, they said, we still share. There were so many volunteers who helped, you know, people helped each other. They protected each other. It just unbelievable, you know, that the war uncovered that side of humans that we usually don't really see, right? So this was something that was very much astonishing to experience from all their stories as well. And So love for life, right, you can see, resilience and strength, not of their own choosing, not that they wanted to be strong and resilient, but that's what we see there. Love for people and animals, self-sacrifice for others in the country. How many volunteers got killed and how many volunteers are still there? Well, people who are fighting in the front, many of them are volunteers as well. And another very interesting thing was when I talked to one person in Kyiv, he said, once, a journalist asked me a very crazy question. And I said, what was that question? He said, what good occupation brought? Which is very unexpected, right? We always think about negative side. But even if it is a worst experience, right, you could talk about some positive, uplifting aspects like, that deep humanity that we see there. And he said, I thought it's a crazy question, but then I thought it's a good question. And he said, now I have what to live for. He's in his 60s. He said, I'm not going to die. I have to make sure, Ukraine is doing well. I do everything every day to help, Ukraine win this war. And for him, this was a huge motivation to do small and big everyday tasks to help his country and his people. Now, if you end up in Kyiv and know nothing about the war, you may think there is no war, right? That's how Kyiv looks like, And the first day when I was in Lviv, I was just totally confused, But you take a few steps, right? And you talk to people and you realize that it's everywhere. The war is everywhere. And of course, those sirens sound, but there is a chance, especially for young people, just to forget everything, right? And live and enjoy life. And the life and freedom has a very different, not an abstract sense for many of them. That's how the maps look like when drones come. So this is, I think that's during July. I don't remember exactly. No, maybe this is, well, these maps are from July when I was there and I was just looking at the phone. They show where the drones come, right? Kyiv is in the middle. And you could see how the drone attacks have increased in 2025, compared to 24, right? So the smaller ones are 2024, and now it's extremely many attacks. And this is Kupiansk, one of the cities, the front line. It looks so peaceful, but it is actually a front line, right? Near Kupiansk that is basically leveled nowadays. And here are my conclusions that, these stories are a form of justice. When Russians, feed people with lots of propaganda, people want to talk and they want, to tell the truth, what they are going through. They in a sense, they are calls for justice, for action, for help, and for the end of war. And you have seen, that it's not simply crimes of war, right, or crimes against humanity that matter, but also everyday terror. And that's what occupation does, They need to decapitate the elites, the activists, the government, and to subjugate others into collaboration or silence, internal exile. So that's total restructuring of who you are and what your life is all about. So when you hear about occupation, right, and war as well, remember that occupation is not peace, right? It's not peace. It's what we talked about. And of course, this is just kind of a snapshot. It's just some time. It's one area, but that gives us a lens to look into other areas as well. And it's not a change of flags, right? It's not simply a change of flags. All right, thank you so much for being so patient. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. And if you know anybody who lived under occupation in Ukraine, here is my email. Please send these people to me. And if you have any ideas how to help, people who are displaced, let me know as well. And if anybody would like to have a partner in Ukraine and teach English, we can work with Dr. Norris on that and put you in touch with a Ukrainian contact as well. All right.
Thank you, Neringa. So we do have 10 minutes for questions, so please stay. I'll let Dr. Klumbytė call on people from the audience. It's easier for you, and then I'll let her know when we're close.
Yes, please.
I do have a question. Could you go back to the slide with the closing?
Could you speak up, please?
I do have a question, but could you go back to the slide with the quote on
This one?
the previous, talking about how even smart people become like loud animals.
In 2014.
Oh, yeah.
I really like the quote. But my question
Okay.
is, so you talked about how you stepped down in Kyiv and you looked at people around you, the sites, and it didn't scream like what was happening. You took a few steps and you went, okay, the signs are everywhere. How did the body language of the people you met with compare from, say, an area like Kyiv, which is close to the main occupied zones, but still like in a safe zone under Ukraine, versus like the body language of people within the occupied regions? Like, what did you notice as?
Wow, this is an extremely important question, and I'm not sure I'll be able to answer it to you. I could just quickly draw on some examples from people who told me about body language. They would say, those who lived in occupation, they would say, I can recognize people on the street who lived under occupation from the way they look and they feel. And this is very interesting because this was the same what Holocaust, people who are descendants of Holocaust survivors would tell me as well. That they can recognize people, who lived because of the same experience. So this is something, that connects and you immediately kind of recognize. So that pain, is just really embodied and you kind of see into another person. Now, for me, I couldn't tell the difference until I talked to people. I cannot answer that question, in any way. There was, and maybe I'm not such a good observer, but I could not tell the difference. Yes, the short that or the short is first, I guess.
I'm wondering, the people that you interviewed, were they ethnically Russian or ethnically Ukrainian? And if they were both groups, whether you noticed a difference in their responses?
Yeah, so this is the question that we did not ask because it is a very politicized question, and it's simply not kind of appropriate to ask because by saying, are you ethnically Russian, you kind of already saying, okay, you are with them then. So I purposefully never asked that question, but some would say, I'm ethnically Russian. Some would say my parents are in Russia. Now, whether the answers were different, no. This is very interesting, and this is also something like there are people who are pro-Russian in those areas. And they probably stayed in those areas. We didn't talk to them, So this is a specific pool of people. I talked to a person who lived in Russia, and when Crimea was occupied, left to live in Ukraine because couldn't stand all, the propaganda. In Ukraine, he was caught up, by the war in 2022. So So he hardly escaped. That was the person who stayed 16 days in Yama, in that pit. And then, in Підвали, in the basement. He escaped to Lithuania, luckily, and I interviewed him in Lithuania. And he said, if the war comes here, we are learning how to shoot, we are learning how to fight. We're tired from running from the war. He was ethnically Russian. His wife was Ukrainian. But the war, the distinction between ethnicities is, it's really, whether you are Ukrainian citizen, rather who you are ethnically. That ethnicity really does not matter during the war. And, what matters, like I talked about loss, people would say, I lost my relatives. I don't talk to them because they are in Russia and they are saying they are supporting Putin. They lost friends, in Russia. So those disconnections and disruptions are not really ethnic, and ethnicity matters, basically doesn't matter here. It matters, where you stand in this work.
Yeah, so being a scholar typically is intrinsically somewhat detached, but you're no ordinary scholar. You have the courage to go and confront trauma head on and bear witness to these people's stories, which I'm sure you know is critical for healing and resilience, is to have someone bear witness to trauma. How did it change you, not as a scholar, but as a human?
Yeah. That's a great question. Well, of course, we all have those questions. Although you came to college, I tell sometimes students, write, down the diary on the first day and then, look at your diary after 4 years and see how you have been changed. So everything changes us. So I did the same what I advised to my students. I wrote a diary on the first days, when I arrived to Kyiv to see how much I have changed or not by that experience. I didn't look at it yet. And I stopped writing it very soon because I didn't have time. But yeah, so my idea was, usually when I interview people, I feel empathy and I'm very much emotionally supportive. I tried, to keep distance, not to get affected to be able to continue this research because I know myself. And I know I will not be able to carry it. So I tried purposefully to not to be affected by some very, very hard, and painful stories. But at the same time, of course they are part of me. And of course you hear me talking very emotionally, right? How can you talk about these things in a detached voice? I don't really know. So this is something, for those who are scholars or future scholars, or you just thinking about. I started reading literature because, our scholarly tools and our detached voice cannot capture all what is going on. Plus, it kind of dehumanizes, right, by telling that story in a neutral way. So, this is something for us to think about. But at this point, you can tell different stories. You can tell in a neutral way about occupation, but you can tell also in a way that helps us to understand what is happening. And emotions are part of being in the world, So we lose that entire part if we are just speaking about things in a detached way.
Stories are so important.
Yeah. The one thing that really has changed, I'll tell you a very banal thing. Yeah, you probably have heard it from others that, don't take things for granted, right? You have a very good life in the United States. You have home, you have food, you have friends. So, and yeah, right, we know it, right? It's so banal. But now I know it for sure. Now it's like, I look at my Christmas, I remember I was looking at the Christmas pictures in Kyiv, and they look surreal. They look unbelievable. And freedom is not abstract to me anymore. I know how it feels from the Ukrainian stories.
Oh, we're at time, and that's about as eloquent an ending as I think we could have possibly hope for. So please join me in thanking Dr. Klumbytė.